I moved out of this area when I got married, so I kind of forgot how the traffic is on the way back. So it took me about an hour and a half to get here. But I want to start off the talk by giving a short preface about the whole issue of the historical miracles of the Quran. Again, by the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستهديه ونؤمن به ونتوكل عليه ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا والصلاة والسلام على خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. First of all, we're gonna go to this a little bit, but first, it's important that we understand that history needs to be studied generally and in the Quran specifically. This is a must for all students of all majors. The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fills the Quran with historical events shows us how important the study of history is to human beings. This allows us to learn, to experience and acknowledge the past so that we don't repeat the same mistakes and progress without the same obstacles. Number two is the Quran itself is a miracle. When we talk about historical miracles of the Quran, we have to understand that the Quran itself is a miracle. The stories and events in it show us how spectacular and powerful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. There are things in the Quran that were mentioned for future times, although they were understood by the generation of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. The most well-preserved book is the most well-preserved book in human history. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that we have revealed this book and we will keep it preserved. As a matter of fact, Imam al-Qurtubi actually in his tafsir explained the story which proves this. He said, he wrote about a Christian man, a calligrapher, a master calligrapher, who went and copied the Bible, copied the verses of the Bible, and wanted to make a Bible. So he copied the Bible. And then what he did is he went and he presented it to the highest Christian authority in Andalusia at the time. And he told them to read it. And he asked them, what do you think about this? And the Christian authority told him, wow, this was great. But what the Christian authority didn't realize is that the calligrapher had intentionally put mistakes in the verses, just to check and to see whether that authority actually knew or didn't know the text. So he actually intentionally put mistakes in that text as he was writing it, and the Christian authority still told him that this was a great copy of the Bible. And then he did the same with the Torah. He wrote out the verses of the Torah, but he intentionally made mistakes. And he presented it to the highest authority of Judaism in Andalusia, and that rabbi told him, wow, this is an amazing copy of the Torah. And then he did the same with the Quran. Mind you, this is a Christian calligrapher. He did the same with the Quran, and he wrote out verses of the Quran, and he intentionally made mistakes. Edited the Quran. And then he presented it to a Muslim scholar. And the Muslim scholar read this, and he told him, you have to burn this copy. He said, why is that? And he told him that because there are major mistakes in this. You must burn this copy. And that just shows that no matter where you are in the world, there's one version of this book. It is the most well-preserved book in human history.
What was that?
I'm sorry?
When was that? When that happened?
This is tafsir written by Imam al-Qurtubi. And there's during the Andalusian era. So this is probably a long period of time. I'll give you the specific date. I can give you that from the sources that I used for this. Number three, and to end my preface, studying the Quran in this way, when we study the history particularly, studying the Quran in this way obviously helps us increase our spirituality and relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But also, it allows us to understand the political dynamics of the time of the Prophet ﷺ and historically. Many of the revelations we will study today illustrate historical political climates and conflicts. The fact that the Quran highlights these things is actually very extraordinary. It's indicative to us as Muslims that we can't separate ourselves from politics and must always be engaged in society. Now there are several historical miracles of the Quran. There are actually several, and I'm going to highlight them all, but we're only going to talk about a few of them because of time restraints. I'm not sure how much time I have, so I'm assuming it got cut down because of my lateness. There is the afflictions of Pharaoh and those around him. We know the story of Musa and Pharaoh, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent several afflictions to the people of Pharaoh. Number two is Haman and ancient Egyptian monuments. Haman, the architect. Number three is the Prophet Musa and the sea splitting in two. Another one is the Prophet Musa referred to as a magician and how that played out with the other magicians. the flood of the Prophet Noah, the city of Iram, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These are all historical miracles that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put in the Quran. And the people of Saba and the Aram flood. And of course, the people of Al-Hijr. These are all various historical miracles that are present in the Quran. Of course, there's probably more, but these are the ones that I sort of got to focus on. The first one I'm going to talk about, and one of the most spectacular ones, is the story of Haman and the ancient Egyptian monuments. And this is a very unique historical fact that is placed in the Quran, which took many years, centuries actually, to understand and verify how the Prophet Muhammad actually knew who Haman was. So actually, before we do that, we're going to watch this video, because I felt like Nouman Ali Khan explains it well in 4 minutes.
Historicity of the Quran, the historical integrity of the Quran. Haman. You know who Haman is in the Quran? He is the minister, or one of the ministers of who? Fir'aun. Haman is mentioned in the Quran about 6 times. And Allah tells us about Haman that Fir'aun commanded him to build him a tower. Fir'aun commanded him to build him a tower. Now, is there a mention of a Haman in the Bible? Sure. Is there a mention of Haman building a tower? Sure. But the Haman in the Bible didn't work for Fir'aun. He worked for another king named Xerxes in the biblical book of Esther. So the biblical Catholic scholars in the 1600s, who were first getting into Orientalist studies, Islamic studies, they looked this thing up in the Quran and said, aha, we found a mistake in the Quran. Look, they're talking about Haman working under Fir'aun, while the book of Esther tells us that Haman worked under the king named Xerxes 1,000 years after the Pharaoh in Babylon, not even in Egypt. And he built them a tower. You ever heard the story of the Tower of Babylon? So they challenged the historical integrity of the Quran. Ma'adallah, they said from the disbeliever's point of view, oh, Muhammad must have plagiarized it from a priest and made a mistake because he mixed up the story of the Tower of Babel, right? And the story of Xerxes with the story of the Pharaoh, and he's confused between the two of them. That's what he did. Misquotation in the Quran. What's really interesting is, in the late 1800s, the Catholic scholarship, the body of Catholic scholarship, unanimously denied the book of Esther as a valid source of history. They acknowledged their own book, they acknowledged that their own book, unanimously, is legend, just stories made up, names made up. The Jewish encyclopedia even now tells you the book of Esther has no historical value. None whatsoever. But then it remains, this one question remains. The Quran tells us that this Quran tells Bani Israel about the things that even they disagreed in. Even they disagreed in some stuff, and this Quran tells them. This speaker is giving this to you. He can't be the speaker then. This knowledge is coming from somewhere else. Now check this out. You know Maurice Bucard, this famous Muslim who wrote Bible, Quran, and science? Before he got into that subject, he was a historian. He wanted to study Islamic history. When he came across this problem presented by Catholic priests, he did a little research. You see, what happened in the late 1800s was the Egyptian hieroglyphics were now being revived as a language, because hieroglyphics had died about almost 2,000 years before the Prophet ﷺ. Egyptian hieroglyphics had died as a language, and they were revived by German and French scholars. The study is called Egyptology. They traveled to Egypt, they studied the hieroglyphics, and they developed a scheme of spelling those images and turning them into pronounceable words and all this stuff. Okay, it started about 120, 130 years ago. So they got into this study. And they made documentations of who the ministers that are mentioned in there, the documents of the Egyptians, what their roles were, etc., etc. Maurice travels to France, goes to an Egyptologist and asks him, by the way, in your records, did you see any name Haman? And he says, well, I wouldn't know, you have to go to Germany, but where did you get the name Haman? He said, well, there's a messenger, a man who claims to be a messenger, in the 7th century, who says that there was a minister of Pharaoh, whose name was what? Haman. And he told him to build a tower. He said, that's impossible. Nobody could have had access to any names from that time, because the language has already died at the Prophet's time for how long already? 2,000 years. So he travels to Germany to look up the names of different architects and constructors and ministers under the name, under the Pharaoh, specifically under the Pharaoh at the time of the historical era of Msa Ucr, Moses. What does he find? Haman, minister of the stone quarries. Construction. This name is discovered in the 1900s. They actually have a statue in Austria, I believe, Haman written on it underneath it, provided from Egypt. His name is Haman, in Austria. The statue is sitting there. Now we don't know for sure if that's the Haman of the Quran, but still the name exists. The fact that he's in charge of construction exists, and this is something they didn't have, but which speaker had? The Messenger of Allah, but actually the speaker is who then? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is just from the historical point of view. Something that they used to laugh at the Muslims came back to blow up in their own face. SubhanAllah.
So, we know that very well that the Quran relates the life of the Prophet Musa alayhi salam greatly, with great clarity, as it tells of the conflict with the Pharaoh and his dealings with Bani Israel. The Quran reveals a wealth of information about ancient Egypt. The significance of many of these historical points have only recently come to the attention of many scholars and learned people of the world. If one considers these points with reason, it quickly becomes clear that the Quran and the fountain of information contained within it has been revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for it correlates directly with all major scientific, historic, and archaeological finds in recent times. One such example of this wisdom can be found in the Quranic references to Haman, as we heard earlier, a character whose name is mentioned in the Quran along with Fir'aun. He is mentioned in 6 different places in the Quran, in which it informs us that he was one of Pharaoh's closest allies. Surprisingly, the name Haman is never mentioned in those sections of the Torah pertaining to the life of the Prophet Musa. However, the mention of Haman can be found in the last chapters of the Old Testament as the helper of a Babylonian king who inflicted many cruelties on the Israelites approximately 1,100 years after the Prophet Moses alayhi salam. The Quran, far more in tune with recent archaeological discoveries, reference to the life of the Prophet Musa, as we heard. The criticism thrown at the Book of Islam by some non-Muslims have disappeared by the wayside, as an Egyptian hieroglyphic script had been deciphered approximately 200 years ago with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. Until the 18th century, the writings and inscriptions of ancient Egypt could not be understood. The language of ancient Egypt was made up of symbols rather than words, so it was hard to decipher what those symbols actually meant. But we realized after much study, and as he mentioned, the German and French scholars, that those symbols actually would tell stories and keep records of important events in the same way that modern words do. With the spread of Christianity and other cultural influences in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Egypt forsook its ancient beliefs along with hieroglyphic writing, which was synonymous with that now defunct belief system. Naturally, this made historical and archaeological study virtually impossible. This situation remained until just over 2 centuries ago. Specifically, he talked about those scholars. I'm going to talk about more specifically. In 1799, much to the delight of historians and other learned people, the mystery of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics was solved by the discovery of the tablet called the Rosetta Stone. This amazing find dated back to 196 BC. The importance of this inscription was that it was written in 3 different forms of writing: hieroglyphics, Demotic, a simplified form of ancient Egyptian, and Greek. With the help of the Greek script, the ancient Egyptian writings were decoded. The translation of the inscription was completed by a Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion. Hence, a forgotten language and the events related in it were brought to light. In this way, a great deal of knowledge about the civilization, religion, and social life of ancient Egypt became available to mankind. So they decoded the hieroglyph, and they discovered the name Haman. In the dictionary of the people in the New Kingdom that was prepared based on the entire collection of inscriptions, Haman is said to be the head of stone quarry workers, as he mentioned. The result revealed a very important truth. Unlike the false assertion of the opponents of the Quran, Haman was a person who lived in Egypt at the time of the Prophet Musa. He had been close to the Pharaoh and had been involved in construction work, just as imparted in the Quran. We know that in the Quran, the Pharaoh said, "Counsel, I do not know of any other God for you apart from me. Haman, kindle a fire for me over the clay and build me a lofty tower, so that perhaps I may be able to climb up to Musa's God. I consider him a blatant liar." This is one of the ayat in the Quran, in chapter 28, verse 38. The verse in the Quran describing the event where Pharaoh asked Haman to build a tower is in perfect agreement with this archaeological finding. Through this brilliant discovery, the irrational claims of the opponents of the Quran were demonstrated to be false and intellectually worthless. In a miraculous way, the Quran conveys to us historical information that could not have been possessed or understood at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. Hieroglyphics could not be deciphered until the late 1700s, so the information could not have been ascertained from Egyptian sources. When the name Haman was discovered in the ancient scripts, it was further proof of the infallibility of Allah's word. So that's one of the examples of a historical miracle that is placed in the Quran. We'll jump to another one. We know that the ancient city of Iram Madat al-Imad, as mentioned in Surah Al-Fajr. This is also a unique story. At the beginning of 1990, press releases in well-known Arabic newspapers or newspapers of the world declared, quote, fabled lost Arabian city found. Another one, Arabian city of legend found in the Atlantis of the sands, Ubar. What rendered this archaeological find particularly intriguing was the fact that the city is mentioned in the Quran. Many people had previously suggested that Ad, the people of Iram, was a legend, or that the location in question could never be found. Such people could not conceal their astonishment at this phenomenal discovery. It was Nicholas Clapp, a noted documentary filmmaker and a lecturer on archaeology, who found this legendary city mentioned in the Quran. Being an Arabophile and a winning documentary filmmaker, Clapp had come across a very interesting book during his research on Arabian history. This book was called Arabia Felix, written by the English researcher Bertram Thomas in 1932. Arabia Felix was the Roman designation for the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, known as Yemen and Oman today. The Greeks called this area Eudaimon Arabia, and medieval Arab scholars called it Al-Yaman As-Sa'id. All of these names mean happy Yemen, because the people living in that region used to serve as middlemen in the lucrative spice trade between India and places north of the Arabian Peninsula. In addition, the people living in this region produced and distributed, I don't know if you guys have seen that documentary film about this area. They produced like this called frankincense, which is like this nice smelling aromatic resin like that they get from like rare trees. The English researcher Thomas described these tribes at length and claimed that he found the traces of an ancient city founded by one of these tribes. This was the city known as Ubar by the Bedouins. In one of the trips he made to the region, the Bedouins living in the desert had shown him well-known tracks and stated that these tracks led toward the ancient city of Ubar. Thomas, who showed great interest in the subject, died before being able to complete his research. But Clapp, who examined what the English researcher Thomas wrote, was convinced of the existence of the lost city described in the book. And we know in the Surah Al-Imran, ayah number 137, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whole societies have passed away before your time, so travel about the earth and see the final fate of the deniers. And so basically this is what Clapp was doing. He quickly started his research, attempting to carry on from where Thomas had left the project. So Clapp took two different approaches in his mission to prove the existence of Ubar. First, he found the tracks which the Bedouins said existed, and in order to aid his work, he applied to NASA actually to provide the satellite images of the area. After a long struggle, he succeeded in persuading the authorities to take the pictures of the region he wanted to see. But eventually he got it. Clapp went on to study the ancient manuscripts and maps in the Huntington Library in California. Here he quickly found a map covering the region he was studying so intensely. He found the map drawn by the Greek-Egyptian geographer Ptolemy in 200, which showed the location of an old city found in the region and the paths which actually led up to the city. Meanwhile, his research received a further boost when he received the news that satellite photographs had been taken by members of NASA. In the pictures, caravan trails, which were virtually invisible to the naked eye, caught Clapp's attention. They could only be seen as a whole from the sky. Finally, just to go through all that, thanks to actually the work of this guy, Clapp, and Thomas before him, along with a helping hand from NASA researchers, the location of actually the legendary city that's mentioned in the Quran was discovered and became the headlines, and had been, which had been also the subject of stories told orally by Bedouins for ages. After a short while, excavations began and remains of an old city were brought to light. The lost city was dubbed Ubar, the Atlantis of the sands. But let us ask a question quickly. What was it that proved this to be the city of the people of Ad mentioned in the Quran? And so that's something that also is interesting to sort of analyze. So from the beginning, the study of the site, it was understood that this ruined city belonged to Ad. Researchers discovered Iram's pillars, which were specifically mentioned in the Quran in the form of towers in the land of the people of Ad. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned that in the Quran in Surah Al-Fajr. إِرَمَ ذَاتِ الْعِمَادِ الَّتِي لَمْ يُخْلَقْ مِثْلُهَا فِي الْبِلَادِ. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that the pillars of Iram that were so huge, He signified them, He explained them in a way, illustrated them in a way that they were so huge, الَّتِي لَمْ يُخْلَقْ مِثْلُهَا فِي الْبِلَادِ, that there was nothing like that on earth. There was nothing like that before on earth. These massive pillars that were built, there was nothing like that on earth. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explained and sort of illustrated that to us in the Quran. And one of the members of a research team leading the excavation said that since the towers were alleged to be the distinctive feature of Ubar, and since Iram was mentioned as having towers or pillars, this then was the strongest proof so far that the site they had unearthed was Iram, the city of Ad described in the Quran. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says in the Quran, do you not see what your Lord did with Ad, Iram, of the columns whose like was not created in any land, as I mentioned in Surah Al-Fajr, as seen that the information provided by the Quran about the events of the past is in total agreement with historical information, is another evidence of the fact that the Quran is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we know of another example of when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in Surah Al-Rum, غُلِبَتِ الرُّوم. And so this was an incident where the Romans were defeated. This is an incident where the Romans were defeated. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed that to the Prophet ﷺ, that the Romans had been defeated in battle by the Persians. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in that specific ayah that they were defeated in an area that was really low, or had low depth. And that in 6 to 9 years, the Romans would be victorious again. So there was a prediction that was made in the Quran that the Romans would be victorious in the near future. And so people who had listened to the Prophet at the time were like, alright, yeah, whatever, like, you know, there's just, I mean, you just saw one of the greatest empires get beat by another great empire. There's just, I mean, how do you know this stuff? And so, it's interesting to see how that progressed politically, because that was actually not just a revelation to the Prophet ﷺ, but also illustrated the political climate at the time in Arabia, which was sort of a wedge between the Persian Empire and the Roman Empire. And so, the unique thing about that is years later, only recently with modern technology, that people actually realized that where the battle took place between the Romans and the Persians is actually considered the lowest spot on earth. Anybody know where that is?
The lowest one?
Yeah.
The Dead Sea?
The Dead Sea. So there's a Dead Sea in between Jordan and Palestine, which is in the middle, sort of cuts through the River Jordan, is considered the lowest spot on earth. And so that is what's known historically as the spot where the Romans fought the Persians, and that's where the ayah revealed that غُلِبَتِ الرُّوم, that the Romans had been defeated in that particular spot. But nobody knew at that time that was the lowest spot technologically. Like that nobody had ever assessed the land and see that this was actually the lowest spot on earth, right? Because they didn't have that technology. But that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had revealed in the Quran. Then, what's interesting enough, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala stated from 6 to 9 years that the Romans would beat the Persians, that actually exactly happened. Within a few years, the Romans had defeated the Persians. Technologically innovate the idea of the dam. And so they had actually abundance of fruits and food, and they had managed to actually cultivate their area very well and became one of the most well-known advanced civilizations of history. And then after the flood of Aram, they moved up north to parts of Jordan and Palestine we know today, and they're the ones that actually also built the Petra monument. That if you go to Jordan now, you could visit it. It's like a stone building. So historical, many centuries ago, the community of Saba was one of the 4 biggest civilizations which lived in southern Arabia. Historical sources relating to Saba usually say that this was a culture akin to that of the Phoenicians. That's how back they go. It was particularly involved in commercial activities. The Sabians are recognized by historians as a civilized and cultured people. In the inscriptions of the rulers of Saba, words such as restore, dedicate, and construct are frequently used. The Ma'arib Dam, which is one of the most important monuments of this people,
is an important indication of the technological level this people had reached. The Sabian state had one of the strongest armies in the region and was able to adopt an expansionist policy thanks to its potent army. With its advanced culture and army, the Sabian state was without question one of the superpowers of the time and of the region. This extraordinarily strong army of the Sabian state is also described in the Quran. An expression of the commanders of the Saba army related in the Quran shows the extent of the confidence this army had in itself. The commanders call out to the female ruler, Malikat Saba, the queen of Saba, who is also a very prominent figure in the Quran. And in one of the Quranic ayahs, it said that these men said, "We possess strength and we possess great force, but the matter is in your hands to consider what you command." This is the ayah in chapter number 27, verse number 33 in the Quran. Because of the Ma'arib Dam, which had been constructed with the help of quite advanced technology for that particular era, the people of Saba possessed an enormous irrigation capacity. The fertile soil they acquired by virtue of this technique and their control over the trade route permitted them a splendid lifestyle, as I mentioned. However, instead of thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Quran informs us that they actually turned away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Furthermore, they refused to heed the warnings and reminders issued to them because of these poor moral values. They merited punishment in the sight of Allah, and their dams collapsed, and the flood of Aram ruined all their land. The capital city of the Sabian state was Ma'rib, which was extremely wealthy thanks to its advantageous geographical position. The capital city was very close to the river, and the point where the river reached Jabal Bala was very suitable for the construction of a dam. Making use of this condition, the Sabian people constructed a dam at this location. And I'm going to skip a lot of the history because we don't have that much time. And there's a lot of numbers actually of how high the dam was, and there's a lot of research done on that as well. Because it's actually a very significant thing to just realize how an ancient civilization like that would have such advanced technology. The dam that collapsed in 542 led to the flood of Aram and caused enormous damage. The vineyards, orchards, and fields cultivated for hundreds of years by the people of Saba were completely destroyed following the collapse of the dam. The people of Saba appeared to have entered a period of rapid contraction, at the end of which the Sabian state came to an end. When we examine the Quran in the light of the historical data above, we observe that there is very substantial agreement here. Archaeological findings and the historical data both verify what is recorded in the Quran. As mentioned in the verse, these people who did not listen to the exhortations of their prophet at the time and who rejected faith were in the end punished with a dreadful flood. This flood is described in the Quran in the following verses in chapter 34, ayahs 15 through 17. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "There was for Saba for time a sign in their homeland, 2 gardens to the right and to the left. Eat of the sustenance provided by your Lord and be grateful to Him. A territory fair and happy, and the Lord oft forgiving. But they turned away from Allah, and we sent against them the flood from the dams, and we converted their 2 gardens into gardens producing bitter fruit and tamarisks and some few lote trees. That was the requital we gave them because they ungratefully rejected faith, and never do we give such requital except to such as are ungrateful rejectors." And this is one of the ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned. So I'm going to skip through most of the stuff because there's not much time. So the Christian archaeologist Werner Keller wrote of the Holy Book was right. Basically, there's a book called The Holy Book Was Right. Accepted that the flood of Aram occurring according to the description of the Quran and occurred according to the description of the Quran, and wrote that the existence of such a dam and the destruction of the whole country by its collapse proves that the example given in the Quran about the people of the garden was indeed realized. After the disaster of the Aram flood, the region started to turn into a desert, and the Sabian people lost their most important source of income. And so, which had been before that an agricultural haven, which we see now is obviously Arabia is a big desert, basically. And so these are just some of the examples I wanted to give about the historical miracles of the Quran This is not a subject that I'm necessarily an expert in. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an imam. But I found it to be very interesting that there's a lot of documented evidence proving how accurate the Quran is with regards to these particular things. The Haman story really got me. It was interesting to see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was revealing things to the Prophet that nobody in his community would even know, right? Like nobody in his community had an idea who Haman was. But the Prophet ﷺ was getting revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala about not just Pharaoh, but his associates, people who were in the sort of elite status of Egypt at the time. And so this is actually a very unique concept that we're actually still till today finding new evidence for. But the thing I want to mention also is that a lot of people kind of seek now, like in the age of evidence and the age of information, a lot of people are looking for more sort of factual, concrete things that they can say, look, the Quran said this and it's right, and this is why Islam is the greatest. And that's good and all, it's there. But I also want to mention that when you do that specifically, and at one point or another, you may or may not find the evidence because there's no research done at that point to prove that, right? There's no technology to prove that at that point. Like back in the 1700s or 1500s or 1400s, they didn't have technology that proves the Quran correct like they do now, right? So what if we don't have technology now to prove what the Quran is saying is correct about certain things? What happens to people? What happens to people's faith? Sometimes it gets shaken, right? But it's important to understand that the secular knowledge that proves the Quran correct should not separate us from the spiritual connection that we should have to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and continue that relationship based on the historical narrative that we've seen, but also based on the factual evidence that we collect. And so that is what I'll end it with, inshallah. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. There's actually a lot of online resources to use for this. Some of the biggest names of people that talk about the historical miracles of the Quran, I would say, are Nu'man Ali Khan. A lot of good stuff from him. Sheikh Yas Al-Qadi, there's a lot of good stuff from him. Zakir Naik is also great. Sometimes Yusuf Astif, depends on what kind of stuff you read. And so those are the people you probably want to go to for that kind of stuff. Let's say like in the future MSA decides to put on like a forum or a debate or whatever. So those are good things to look at. And there's also websites. There's actually one website called Miracles of the Quran that shows a lot of things as well. That has a lot of historical evidence and stuff like that. So those are some of the resources that I used compiling this talk. Jazakumullah khairan.